Now, allegations of fake news seem to have become a common phrase amid the conflict in Ukraine. Multiple stories have circulated in the media over the past month, only to be later debunked. RT's Donald Quarter has been taking a closer look at some of them. Let's look at his piece.
Shock and outrage among Western audiences after images of a massacre in a small Ukrainian town near Kiev called Bucha. Many have grabbed their pitchforks and torches blaming Russia, but few have stopped to ask, how do I know what I'm being told is true, since so far the only source is Kiev?
The world has already seen many war crimes at different times on different continents, but it's time to do everything possible to make the war crimes of the Russian military the last manifestation of such evil on earth. Everyone guilty of such crimes will be included in a special book of torturers, will be found and punished.
It's really the job of journalists to examine, scrutinize, and double-check the reliability of their sources. Instead, the mainstream media has been acting more like the Ukrainian government's PR team. Take a look at this segment from CBS.
Shared with us a video, images that your government has gathered of what has been left behind outside of Kyiv that I do want to share with our viewers.
Margaret Brennan of CBS admits that Zelensky's team handed her some photos, videos, and she's now going to broadcast them on TV with zero independent corroboration, just openly purveying a foreign country's war propaganda. This is what's considered real journalism in the U.S.
There were even reports that foreign journalists weren't allowed into the town on the 3rd of April. On top of that, Kiev has time and time again demonstrated it's probably the last government whose word you want to take at face value when it comes to horror stories. Remember Snake Island? Vladimir Zelensky claimed Ukrainian troops valiantly fought to the last soldier defending it.
All 13 Ukrainian defenders were killed in a Russian bombardment on Thursday. All of the border guards died heroically. They did not surrender. They will be awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine posthumously.
Aside from the fact that there weren't 13 but 82 Ukrainian soldiers on the island, they didn't die fighting the Russians either. They surrendered and were safely returned to their families through a prisoner exchange. Oops. Clearly that mistake wasn't embarrassing enough, though, since Zelensky was pretty quickly at it again. Several days later, he claimed Russians had bombed a memorial to the tens of thousands of Jews who were massacred in Babin Yar during the Second World War.
To the world, what is the point of saying never again for 80 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site of Babin Yar? At least 5 killed, history repeating.
In addition to Zelensky's naming and shaming those who didn't immediately point the finger at Russia, turns out that story was fake as well. One day later, an Israeli war correspondent visited the site and saw a completely different picture.
The Babin Yar memorial site was neither destroyed nor damaged. After touring all over the big site, I can report with certainty that no monument was damaged and no bomb, missile or shell hit the area.
It's not clear whether Zelensky was lying or if he really believed what he was told. The main thing is, though, it ended up being yet another fake story put forward by Kiev. There's also the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which Zelensky wrongly accused Russia of bombing. Needless to say, there was no lack of scary projections of another atomic disaster in Europe either.
В Чорнобилі вибухнув один енергоблок, але наші хлопці завжди тримали атомну станцію у безпеці. Щоб не було провокацій, щоб ніхто не міг на станцію піти, щоб ніхто не міг цю станцію захопити.
So, after all these Ukrainian tall tales about alleged Russian crimes, one after another turning out to be fake, should we really just take Kiev's word for it when it comes to Bucha?
Now, the Pentagon says it cannot independently verify the notorious footage from the Ukrainian town of Bucha, adding that, quote, "We have said even before that the Russians were going to be brutal." As we mentioned, Moscow has called the accusations of atrocities in Bucha a staged provocation. RT's Worlds Apart host, Oksana Borku, joined me earlier in the studio to discuss how heart-rendering imagery used to manipulate public opinion is nothing new.
There's a whole genre called atrocity propaganda, and it emerged, I would say that even, a couple of centuries ago, but with the emergence of broadcast television, it's been very popular, and I think one of the most memorable examples, maybe our viewers remember that, the so-called Naraya testimony, the testimony of a 15-year-old simple girl from Kuwait who was with tears in her eyes telling stories about how Iraqi soldiers were, pulling babies from incubators in a hospital, in a Kuwaiti hospital, stealing those incubators and letting those poor babies die on the floor. And that story was picked up by numerous American media. It was repeated by the American President George Bush Sr. at that time. I think he referred to it at least 10 times. It was supposedly independently corroborated by Amnesty International, which conducted supposedly independent research into that, all to be proven false later.
At that time as well, some 17%, I was just reading, of the American public before that testimony were in support of action against Iraq in Kuwait. That rose to 60% following the testimony.
It was very, very instrumental in swaying the public opinion, precisely because it was hitting at the, the most vulnerable point, the butchery, the murderous aggression against the most vulnerable. Who is more vulnerable than babies in incubators? And at the end of the day, it turned out that it wasn't a simple girl from Kuwait. She was actually a daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador.
Well, let's listen, Oksana, to that actual testimony.
Yeah.
We can play it for our viewers now.
I volunteered at the Allà hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
When you look at it, your heart aches, but it was established two years later, as I said, that she was actually a daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, who lobbied very hard for the American troops to go into his country. It was the pretext for the Gulf War. It was later established that a couple of babies actually died in Kuwaiti hospitals, but not because of the Iraqi soldiers who never set their foot there, but because of the Kuwaiti doctors and nurses who deserted the premises. But all was forgotten later on. But come on, in every conflict since then, we had a similar story, be it in Yugoslavia, in Syria, in Libya, some heartbreaking story that served a precise purpose to provoke Western intervention. And I specifically remember, because I was back then on the ground in Libya, in Benghazi, that story of Gaddafi Viagra being distributed among Gaddafi soldiers. And that story had, it went all the way to the International Criminal Court. The head of that court at that time, I think his name was Luis Moreno Campo, went public saying that they have the evidence, that they have the testimony. The American officials, including U.S. Envoy Susan Rice, was very public and very certain that it indeed happened, only to find out after Gaddafi, after, the United Nations authorized a no-fly zone over Libya, and after Gaddafi was brutally murdered and his country was turned into one huge slave market, it emerged rather, that it was false. Even though that story was run by multiple outlets, from BBC to Al Jazeera, it was all false. And
but that doesn't matter, does it? Because the purpose is done. So even if they come out later and say an apology, what is that? In the case of that girl, 50,000 Iraqis died following the testimony.
Absolutely. And one thing, I was listening to your program, to your conversation with the guest earlier, and you asked a question: how come that those formerly sober-thinking journalists were buying it so easily? And it's actually a very valid question. Even the Pentagon is not buying. Even the Pentagon is not siding with the story. But all the international outlets, those formerly or supposedly sober-thinking journalists, they're all running away with this story of butchery at Bucha. And, you need to understand the Ukrainian sort of PR mentality to understand that such coincidence is not coincidental. Butchery and Bucha. I think there were a couple of bright PR minds who decided that, this is a great headline for the Westerners to swallow, and in short term, that calculation, I think, proved accurate.
Just in terms then of the reaction from the information that's being sent from Ukraine, because that's what it is, because people in the West can't make up their own independent minds on what's happening during
with
a
all
war.
the opposing points of view being but taken off the air.
But also, you've got the president going on a drive to virtually every major country in the world going on primetime television, going to Congress, going to Parliament, and getting uncontested questioning about what he's actually saying, what is actually happening. So is that the PR drive that's going to continue? Is that the way this war is going to progress?
Well, at the end of the day, this is all he can do. I mean, he's trying to mitigate and fight this war the best he can. So I'm, the president lying, that's not an issue for me. I think that has been happening with politicians for, times immemorial, since times immemorial.
My point is he's not being challenged.
He's not being challenged. That's precisely, and the alternative points of views are also not allowed.
Right.
Our channel is has been taken off the air of all social media. But one thing I want to mention here is that a couple of years ago, NATO explicitly, publicly passed the doctrine of the so-called cognitive warfare, which in pretty straight terms laid out what they see as an alternative to kinetic warfare, that is manipulation of public opinion, trying to shape the views, the public views in the country to the favor of that political position, and this is exactly what they're doing. They've been investing in that for quite some time. The Ukrainians got a lot of help and support and expertise from the West, and ultimately they are banking on the fact that perception is reality. This famous phrase that the Americans like to repeat, and I think the Russians, or the Russian leadership at least, is banking on the opposite premise, that reality sooner or later will reassert itself, and it will. I've been through that multiple times, and I can promise you this story is going to fall apart within the next couple of months, if not weeks.